You can't love others until you meet yourself. It's 3 in the morning. You're scrolling through your feed, looking at pictures of happy couples, reading quotes about true love, and there's this emptiness in your chest that no relationship has ever been able to fill. Ever wondered why? Maybe, just maybe, the problem was never about finding the right person. Maybe the problem is that you haven't found yourself yet. You know that pattern you might recognize in your life? You get into a relationship with hope. This time it'll be different. This time you've found someone who really gets you. Someone who's going to fill that empty space you've been carrying for so long. And at first, it's magic. You feel complete. You feel seen. You finally feel whole. But then, weeks or months later, that feeling starts to fade. Slowly, subtly, you start noticing little things that bother you. The way they talk, how they react to things, how they don't understand you the way you'd hoped. And that emptiness, it comes back. So you ask yourself, did I choose the wrong person? Is there someone out there who'll actually complete me? And the cycle starts all over again. Alan Watts spent decades observing this pattern, not just in romantic relationships, but in all forms of human connection, friendships, family, even the relationship you have with strangers on the street. And what he discovered goes against everything popular culture has taught us about love. He realized something profound, something most people spend their entire lives never seeing. You can't find in someone else what you haven't found in yourself yet. Think about that for a moment. When you look to another person for love, what are you really looking for? You're looking for validation. You're looking for someone to confirm that you're enough, that you're worthy, that you deserve to be loved. But if you haven't found yourself yet, if you haven't spent real time with yourself in the depths of your own consciousness, how can you expect another person to find you? It's like trying to show someone a place you've never visited yourself. And here's the cruel irony. The more you seek love outside yourself, the more distant it seems. The more you try to cling to someone to fill your void, the more that void grows. Because the void isn't there due to lack of external love. It's there because there's a distance between you and yourself, a separation between who you think you are and who you really are. And no relationship, no matter how deep, can cross that distance for you. This isn't a message of despair. Actually, it's exactly the opposite. Because once you realize this, once you understand that the journey begins inside you, not outside, something shifts completely. Relationships stop being about filling voids and become about sharing fullness. Love stops being about finding someone to complete you and becomes about finding someone you can be completely yourself with. And that's what we're going to talk about for the next, 20 minutes or so. I'm not going to give you 5 practical steps or relationship techniques. This isn't that kind of conversation. This is a conversation about what happens when you really find yourself, about why that changes not just your relationships, but the way you exist in the world, and why Alan Watts believed that meeting yourself is, perhaps, the most important thing you can do while you're alive. Oh, and before we continue, if you're here at 3 in the morning, looking for something that makes sense in the middle of the chaos, you're not alone. This channel exists for these conversations, for these moments of quiet, where we can finally think clearly. If this resonates with you, consider subscribing. Not out of obligation, but because maybe you need these conversations as much as I need to have them. And if you like the video, it helps other people find this message when they need it most. All right, let's go. Alan Watts used to say something that, the first time I heard it, seemed almost offensive. He said, "Every person who comes into your life is a mirror." And I remember thinking, no, they're not. Some people are genuinely wonderful, and others are, well, complicated. Yeah. But the more I sat with this idea, the more I realized how deep it goes. See, when Watts talks about mirrors, he's not saying other people are literally you. He's saying something more subtle, something you can only see when you really pay attention. The things you love in someone, their qualities you recognize because they exist in you, even if they're dormant, even if you've never given them permission to shine. And the things that deeply irritate you about another person, the traits that make you want to run out of the room, usually they're aspects of yourself that you've never accepted, parts of you that you rejected so long ago you don't even remember they exist. Think about the last time someone deeply irritated you. Maybe it was how they constantly sought attention, or how controlling they were, or defensive, or how they could never admit they were wrong. Now, and this is going to be uncomfortable, ask yourself, is there any part of me that does this too? Not in the same obvious way, maybe, but is there a shadow of it in you? Because here's what Watts realized. You can only recognize something outside yourself if there's already a resonance of it inside you. If you'd never had a trace of arrogance in another person simply wouldn't affect you. You'd see it, notice it, and move on. But when something deeply triggers you, when something makes your blood boil, it's because it's touching something unresolved in you. And this is where relationships get complicated, because most of us enter relationships hoping to find someone who makes us feel good about ourselves, someone who reflects only the parts of us we approve of. But life doesn't work that way. The people closest to you will inevitably reflect all parts of you, the beautiful and the ugly, the ones you embrace and the ones you hide under the bed at 3 a.m. when nobody's watching, and when those shadow parts appear in the mirror, when someone close acts in a way that shows you something you don't want to see in yourself. The instinctive reaction is to blame the mirror. The problem is this person. If they changed, I'd feel better. But Watts would say, no, the problem isn't the mirror. The problem is you're seeing something in yourself you haven't integrated yet. Idai, this doesn't mean you have to accept toxic behavior. I'm not saying that. Sometimes someone really is destructive and you need to create distance. That's wisdom, not rejection. But even in those cases, even when you choose to leave, it's still worth asking, what did this person show me about myself? What was I trying not to see? Because every relationship you have, from the deepest to the most superficial, is showing you parts of yourself. Harmonious relationships show you the parts you've already integrated, the parts you're at peace with. And difficult relationships, those are the greatest teachers, because they show you exactly where you still need to find yourself. I had a relationship once where the person was suffocating, always needed to know where I was, what I was doing, who I was talking to, and I felt indignant. How can she be so insecure? How can she not trust? It took me years to realize I was exactly the same. I just expressed it differently. I didn't ask where the person was physically. but I constantly monitored emotionally. Needed to know if she was happy with me, if she still loved me, if I was being enough. It was the same insecurity, the same fear, just manifesting differently. And when I finally saw that, when I finally stopped blaming the mirror and looked at what it was reflecting, something shifted, not just in that relationship, in all relationships. Because here's the truth Watts was trying to show us. Until you find yourself, until you really sit in your own company and make peace with all the parts of who you are, you'll keep looking for in others what only you can give yourself. Validation, acceptance, the feeling of being complete. And people will keep reflecting back to you exactly the parts you're avoiding. Not because the universe is cruel, but because the universe is desperately trying to show you where you need to look. Relationships don't exist to complete you. They exist to show you where you haven't found yourself yet. There's a lie that Western culture has been telling for so long that most of us don't even notice it's a lie anymore. It's the idea that you're incomplete, that there's a missing half. A soulmate, someone out there who's going to complete you. And this lie, it sells. It sells movies, songs, books, therapy, coaching. It sells the idea that love is about finding the right person who'll fill the hole inside you. But Alan Watts looked at this and said something radical. He said, "You're already complete. You always have been." This isn't just a motivational statement. It's not about feeling good about yourself or pretending there aren't problems. It's an observation about the nature of reality. See, when you were born, you weren't born incomplete. You were born whole, a complete system. Nothing was missing. Sure, you were vulnerable. You depended on others to survive. But dependence isn't the same as incompleteness. Incompleteness, that feeling that something fundamental is missing, that's a story you learned later. You learned it when your cry wasn't answered quickly enough. You learned it when you expressed emotions that weren't accepted. You learned it when parts of you were rejected, criticized, or ignored. And slowly, over the years, you built this narrative. If I were different, I'd be loved. If I were more this or less that, I'd be enough. And from that moment on, you began the search for someone who would validate that you're enough. Someone who would fill the space that opened up between who you really are and who you learned you should be. But here's the cruel trap. The more you seek completeness in another person, the more you reinforce the belief that you're incomplete. Because every time you look at someone and think, this person will make me feel whole, you're telling yourself, I'm not whole on my own. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You enter the relationship feeling incomplete. Then you place on the other person the impossible task of completing you. And when they inevitably fail, because no human being can complete another, you use it as proof that you were right all along. See, I'm not enough. Even this person can't make me feel complete. And the cycle continues. Watts saw this pattern repeat infinitely. And what he realized is that the problem was never the relationships. The problem is, you're asking the relationship for something it was never designed to give. A relationship can't complete you because you were never incomplete. What a relationship can do, what it does magnificently when you understand this, is show you where you forgot you were already complete. Think of it like this. Imagine you're a complete, intricate, stained glass window. Every piece of colored glass is a part of who you are. Together, They create a complete and beautiful image, but over life, you started covering certain pieces. Maybe because someone said that color was ugly, or because that part of you caused pain once. So you cover those pieces with dark sheets, with stories, with defense mechanisms. And eventually, you look at yourself and only see the parts you left uncovered, and you think, something's missing. I'm not complete. But the truth is, the pieces were always there. You just stopped looking at them. And that's what happens when you find yourself. It's not about adding something new. It's not about becoming a better or more evolved version. It's about removing the sheets. It's about looking at the parts you hid and saying, okay, this is me too. It's about integrating, about bringing back into consciousness all the parts you rejected. And when you do that, when you really find yourself, something extraordinary happens. You stop seeking completeness because you realize nothing was ever missing. And in that moment, in that exact moment, relationships transform completely. Because now you're not entering a relationship as someone who needs to be filled. You're entering as someone who's already whole, simply wanting to share that wholeness with another person who's also whole. And that's the difference between love that suffocates and love that liberates, between love that demands and love that simply is, between relationships that drain and relationships that nourish. The difference isn't in the other person. The difference is in you having found yourself first. Okay? So if the journey is about finding yourself, the obvious question is, how? How do you actually find yourself? And this is where most advice fails, because they'll give you a list. Get therapy, meditate, journal, travel alone. And look, those things can help, but they're not the thing itself, because finding yourself isn't an activity. It's not something you add to your to-do list between gym and groceries. It's more like stopping running. Alan Watts had an interesting way of putting this. He said, "You're already with yourself. You've never been separate. The problem is you're constantly trying to escape that company." Think about how many hours of your day you spend avoiding being truly alone with your thoughts. You wake up and immediately grab your phone. You fill every moment of silence with music, podcasts, social media. You schedule every free second with activities, people, distractions. And when there's finally a moment of quiet, those few seconds between sleeping and waking, or when you're driving alone, or at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep, you feel uncomfortable, because in that silence, things start to emerge. Thoughts you've been avoiding, emotions you've been burying, parts of you've been rejecting. And instead of staying with them, instead of allowing them to be felt, you grab the phone again, turn on the TV, call someone, anything to fill that space. Finding yourself begins when you stop doing that, when you finally have the courage to sit in the silence and say, okay, what's here? What am I feeling? What am I avoiding? It's not comfortable. I won't lie about that. At first, it's like looking at a room you've kept locked for years. It's messy. It's full of things you don't want to see. Memories, shame, regrets, fears. But here's what Watts understood. These things only have power over you when you avoid them. When you finally look at them, when you bring them into the light of consciousness, they start to lose their charge. I spent years afraid of being alone, always needed someone around, always needed to be doing something, always in motion, until one day Through circumstances I won't get into, I was forced to spend time alone, a lot of time, without distractions, without escapes. And at first it was terrible. It was like detox. My mind screamed for stimulation, for anything that would take me out of my own head. But eventually, after the initial agitation calmed down, something started to happen. I started to hear myself, not the surface voice that comments on the day or plans the future, but a deeper voice, a more subtle awareness. And that awareness started showing me things. It showed me where I was lying to myself, where I was betraying my own values out of fear of rejection, where I was building a persona that wasn't really me. And it was painful to see, but it was also liberating, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't performing. I wasn't trying to be someone. I was simply being. And that's what Watts meant when he talked about finding yourself. It's not about discovering some idealized version of yourself. It's not about becoming more conscious, more evolved, more enlightened. It's about stopping pretending. It's about allowing all parts of you to exist, the bright parts and the shadow parts, the parts you love and the parts you wish you could change. It's about integration, not perfectionism. So when you ask, how do I find myself? The answer isn't a technique. The answer is, stop running from yourself. Sit in silence regularly, not to meditate in the formal way, but just to be with yourself. Observe your thoughts without judgment. When something uncomfortable appears, don't look away. Sit with it. Ask, what is this trying to show me? Observe your patterns in relationships. When you feel triggered, instead of blaming the other person, ask, what is this reflecting about me? Observe where you seek external validation. How many times do you check social media? How many times do you need confirmation that you're loved, valued, enough? And each time you observe this, you don't need to judge yourself. You don't need to change immediately. You just need to see, because seeing is the first step. Awareness is where transformation begins. And over time, with patience, you start to know yourself. Not the version of you that other people know, not the version you present to the world, but you, the real you, the complete you. And when you know that person, when you really sit in the company of that being, something extraordinary happens. You stop needing other people to know you in a specific way. You stop needing constant approval. You stop looking for in relationships something you already have. And relationships, they start to change, not because the other person changed, but because you finally showed up completely. There's a profound difference between loving someone and needing someone. Most of us confuse the two. We call it love when really it's need in disguise. It's dependency with a pretty bow around it. And you can feel the difference in your body. When it's need, there's a tension, an urgency, a tightness in your chest that says, don't leave me, don't abandon me. I need you to feel whole. When it's love, there's a lightness, an openness, an expansion that says, I'm okay with myself, and I choose to share this with you. Alan Watts observed that most relationships in the Western world are built on need, not love. Two incomplete people meeting, hoping that together they'll make a whole. And it works, for a while. At the beginning of passion, you really do feel complete. That person's presence fills all the voids, and you think, finally I found it. But then the initial chemistry fades, reality sets in, and you realize the person can't give you that feeling of completeness 24/7, and that's when need manifests. Why don't you call me like you used to? Why do you need time alone? Why don't you make me feel like you used to? And slowly, what seemed like love transforms into a negotiation, a transaction. I'll give you validation if you give me security. I'll give you attention if you give me purpose. And both people get trapped in this dance of unmet needs, each waiting for the other to fill the void that only they can fill themselves. But when you find yourself first, when you make peace with your own completeness, love becomes something completely different. Now you're not entering the relationship with outstretched hands begging, "Fill me." You're entering with open hands offering, "Here's what I have," freely, without conditions. And the difference is everything. Love without need doesn't mean you don't care. It doesn't mean indifference. It means you care deeply, but not from a place of lack. You care from a place of abundance. You don't need the person to make you happy because you've already cultivated happiness in yourself. You don't need the person to validate your worth because you've already recognized your own worth. You don't need the person to fill your lonely days because you've learned to appreciate your own company. So what's left? What's left is pure love, unconditional love, love that says, "I choose you, not because I need you, but because I want to share this journey with you." And that changes the entire dynamic, because now, when the person needs space, you don't panic, you understand, because you need space sometimes too. When the person can't be emotionally available for a day, you don't fall apart, because your emotional stability doesn't depend on their constant presence. When the person changes, grows, evolves in ways you didn't expect, you don't try to keep them in the box of the version you fell in love with. You celebrate their growth, because you're not trying to keep someone in a box that serves your needs. You're simply appreciating the complete human being they are, constantly changing, constantly evolving. I know this might sound idealistic, like it's impossible to achieve, but here's the truth. Every time you work on finding yourself, you get closer to this. Every time you sit with your own discomfort, instead of projecting it onto another person, you get closer to this. Every time you observe your need for validation and choose to validate yourself first, you get closer to this. It's a process, not a destination, and you don't need to be perfect at it. You don't need to eliminate all need from your heart, but you can start to distinguish. You can start to notice, is this love or need speaking? Am I connecting or clinging? And the more you find yourself, the more you cultivate your own completeness, the more your relationships transform, because now you're not looking for someone to complete you anymore. You're looking for someone to share your completeness with. And that's the difference between relationships that suffocate and relationships that expand, between love that imprisons and love that liberates, between need disguised as love and love that's so free that even letting go would be an act of love. Because in the end, true love doesn't say, "I can't live without you." True love says, "I can live fully on my own and still choose to have you in my life." Here's the paradox Alan Watts loved exploring. The more you find yourself, the more comfortable you become being alone, the more deeply you can connect with others. Sounds contradictory, doesn't it? You'd expect the opposite. You'd expect that becoming self-sufficient would mean you need less connection, that you'd become distant, isolated, less capable of intimacy. But Watts saw that the exact opposite happens, because see, when you haven't found yourself yet. Every interaction with another person is filtered through your unmet needs. You're not really seeing the other person. You're seeing what they can do for you, how they can validate you, how they can fill your voids. It's like looking at someone through foggy glass. You see a shape, a silhouette, but not the details, not the real essence. But when you find yourself, when you no longer need the person to be something specific for you, the glass clears, and for the first time, you can actually see the person, not as a means to your needs, but as a complete human being with their own complexity, their own journey, their own completeness. And that's where true connection happens. Not when two needs meet, but when two completenesses meet. It's like two oceans meeting, not to fill each other, but simply to share the vastness. Think about the last time you felt true connection with someone, not attraction, not need, but that rare moment where you felt you really saw someone and were seen by them. It was probably a moment where there was no agenda, where you weren't trying to impress or get something, where you were simply present, and the other person was present too. And in that space of mutual presence, something happened. You felt it. You felt the shared humanity, the vulnerability, the connection that exists beneath all personas and protections. That's what becomes possible when you find yourself, because you're no longer hiding behind masks. You're no longer performing. You're simply being. And when you're simply being, you give permission for the other person to simply be too. Watts said most people are afraid of real intimacy. Not the romantic kind, but the kind where you're completely seen, where all your defenses drop, where you're naked, not physically, but emotionally. And that fear, it makes sense, because if you haven't accepted yourself yet, if you're still rejecting parts of yourself, the idea of being completely seen is terrifying. What if they see the parts of me I hide? What if they see I'm not enough? So you keep distance. You show only the approved parts. You keep the relationship at a superficial level where you're safe. But when you find yourself, when you've already seen all your parts and made peace with them, there's nothing left to hide. You can be seen completely because you've already seen yourself completely. And in that vulnerability, in that willingness to be known, there's a connection that's impossible to reach any other way. It's strange, isn't it? The more comfortable you become with yourself, the more capable you become of losing yourself in another, not in the codependent way, but in the way where you can actually meet someone in the space beyond words, in the space where consciousness recognizes consciousness, where you realize that beneath all the superficial differences, beneath all the stories and identities, there's something shared. Watts called this the true self. The consciousness that's looking through your eyes is the same consciousness looking through theirs. And when you find yourself enough to touch that consciousness in yourself, you start recognizing it in others. And recognizing that is love in its purest form. So the paradox isn't really a paradox. You don't become less capable of connection when you find yourself. You become capable of real connection, true connection. The kind of connection where you can be with someone in silence and feel complete communion. The kind where you can completely disagree and still respect each other's humanity. The kind where you can witness someone's pain without trying to fix it, just holding space for it to exist. And relationships built on that kind of connection, they're unbreakable, not because they never face challenges, but because they're not built on need. They're built on mutual recognition, on seeing and being seen, on loving without needing, on connecting without losing yourself. And all of this begins when you finally stop running from yourself and simply look. It's almost 4 in the morning now. If you're still here, thank you for staying. These conversations, they matter, even if we never meet. Even if you close this tab in a few seconds and go back to your life, something shifted just because you stopped to listen. Alan Watts spent decades trying to communicate a simple truth that most people spend their entire lives never realizing. You can't find out there what you haven't found in here yet. Not in love, not in approval, not in validation, not in completeness. Every relationship you'll have, all of them will only be as deep as the relationship you have with yourself. This isn't a sentence, it's a liberation, because it means you're not at the mercy of finding the right person. You don't need to wait for someone to show up and make you feel whole. You already have everything you need. You always have. So what do you do with this? Well, you don't need to do anything dramatic. You don't need to end all your relationships or go to the Himalayas seeking enlightenment. You just need to start paying attention. Pay attention the next time you seek validation from someone. Don't judge yourself. Just observe. Pay attention the next time you feel triggered in a relationship. Ask, what is this showing me about myself? Pay attention in the moments when you're alone. Do you immediately look for distraction? Or can you sit in your own company and gradually, without pressure, without a timeline, you start to find yourself. You start seeing the parts you've been avoiding, and instead of rejecting them, you invite them to the table. You start understanding that completeness isn't about being perfect. It's about being whole. And being whole means embracing everything you are. I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not saying I have this all figured out. There are still days where I look outside for what I can only find inside. Days where I forget I'm already complete and fall into the old trap of trying to be filled by another person. But the difference now is I notice, and noticing is half the journey. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And slowly, over time, you choose differently. Not through discipline, but because you finally understood that the love you were looking for in others, it was always waiting for you to come home, to yourself. So if you take just one thing from this conversation, let it be this. Before you look for someone to love, before you demand that someone know you, know yourself first. Sit in your own company. Look at the parts you've been avoiding. Make peace with who you really are, and then go out into the world. And you'll discover that relationships are no longer about filling voids. They're about sharing abundance, about two complete people choosing to walk together, not because they need to, but because they want to. And that's where true love lives. If you want to continue these conversations, if they resonate with you the way they resonate with me, you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel. Not because I need the numbers, but because maybe you need these reflections at 3 in the morning when nothing else makes sense. And if this video helped you somehow, share it with someone who needs to hear this, with someone who's stuck in the same cycle of seeking completeness where it can't be found. Until the next late night conversation, take care of yourself, And remember, you're already complete. You always have been.